Zhor had never personally interfaced with a human, a statistical anomaly given his professional standing, but he'd certainly processed the raw data. As a lead trauma surgeon at the Quadrant Second-Tier Medical Hub, a massive, sprawling architecture of high-density polymers and fiber-optic nervous systems, he was essentially a node in a vast network of galactic hearsay. The humans were less like a biological presence and more like a pervasive software update, or perhaps a persistent rumor propagated through low-bandwidth deep space comms. These bipedal carbon units weren't exactly new in the sense of a sudden supernova. They were more like a slow-moving, predatory colonial lichen, gradually metastasizing outward from a terrestrial gravity well. Every local solar cycle brought fresh packets of anecdotal evidence to the Citadel's airlocks. What had once been the domain of friend-of-a-friend cryptography, low-fidelity myths shared over synthesized ethanol, had hardened into a legitimate ethnographic phenomenon. Humans were the current mimetic contagion of the Quadrant. Every week, some itinerant spacer would pull into a docking bay with a high-bandwidth tale about the Death Worlders, framing their biological resilience in terms that bordered on the transcendental or the purely insane. Zhor, whose cognitive architecture was hardwired for the cold, binary logic of the empirical fact, viewed these narratives with a specialized form of academic derision. He was a practitioner of the hard science, a man for whom the four-hemisphere brain was a precision instrument that didn't have room for the ghost-in-the-machine mysticism of human legends. But then came a specific temporal coordinate, a fated solar cycle, where he was forced to perform a direct observation of the impossible, and the data stream changed the fundamental geometry of his worldview. The day was a classic example of logistical stagnation. Most of the heavy-lift transports and bulk haulers had executed their burnout of the system the previous shift, taking their associated industrial accidents and malnourished crews with them. Zhor drifted through the high-voltage corridors like a slow-moving data packet, his forelimbs operating in a state of high concurrency as he pushed memos to colleagues, a feat of multi-threaded processing made possible by the unique quad-core arrangement of his cortical hemispheres. Then, the facility's local environment flipped into an emergency state. The lighting shifted to a high-frequency red, a visual interrupt that demanded immediate attention. Radio frequency bursts pinged his lateral receptors with a sense of urgent packet loss as he oriented his mass toward the primary medical artery. The signal resolved into a frantic, low-fidelity voice. "Doctor, we have an emergency SOS from the Hyperion. Immediate med-evac requested." To Zhor, the nomenclature was like an unparsed string of foreign code. Species scans indicate human freelance vessel. If his medical conditioning hadn't been so robustly hard-coded, he might have suffered a total system crash. Repeat, humans. Biological schematic incoming. The data bloomed in his posterior cortical zone, a high-resolution wireframe of the unknown. The human was an improbable piece of biological engineering, a 10-unit vertical stack balanced on a bipedal endoskeleton, with a dangerously centralized nervous system housed in a single, two-hemisphere skull. It was a high-maintenance, carbon-based machine powered by a primitive, single-point circular pump and a chaotic plumbing system of smooth muscle. Despite the apparent flaws in the architecture, Zhor felt a certain professional confidence. He knew enough about general vertebrate mechanics to patch the thing together, even if he still suspected the Death Worlder myths were just a form of collective hallucination. He took up a position in the central triage sanctum, supported by two junior surgical acolytes. They waited in a thick, pressurized silence until the sonic boom of atmospheric reentry announced the arrival of the Hyperion. The noise was a heavy, low-frequency rumble, crude, industrial, and distinctly human. The primary pressure doors were forced open, and three of the creatures rushed in, physically pushing a fourth who was strapped into a low-tech wheeled transport. A high-saturation red fluid, biologically identifiable as hemoglobin-based oxygen carrier, was painted across the victim's anterior surface like a piece of visceral abstract art. Zhor triggered his universal translator, an algorithmic bridge meant to translate human linguistic quirks into something logically consistent. "It's going to be fine, Captain," one of the humans said, his voice a jagged waveform of stress. "You're going to be okay. Just maintain head-neck alignment for the love of everything holy." Zhor noted the universal medical insignia on the human's upper limb, a cross-platform icon for emergency. This was a hot landing, a desperate pivot from deep space transit to planet-side surgery. The central figure was a mess of obscured physical geometry, his neck stabilized by a primitive foam collar, held upright by a crewmate who treated him with a careful reverence usually reserved for unexploded ordnance or ancient hardware. The group hit the center of the room and stopped. As the humans adjusted their formation, Zhor finally got a clear look at the patient. It was a spectacle that belonged more in a high-budget horror simulation or post-mortem archive than a living triage unit. He involuntarily emitted a high-amplitude, ultrasonic shrill, a hard-coded response to extreme biological dissonance, and prayed the human's low-fidelity audio receptors wouldn't pick it up. The male patient sat with a terrifying, statue-like stillness. From his right ocular socket, a dark, viscous fluid leaked around the edges of a jagged iron rod that had been driven through the center of his skull like a structural support beam. His crewmates were making high-pitched, distressed vocalizations, biological noise pollution born of pure terror. Zhor's internal logic engine began calculating the trajectory. The rod was surveyor's stake, and it had clearly intersected with primary cortical tissue. By any known law of neurobiology, the human was a dead man walking, or in this case, a dead man sitting. Every medical textbook in the quadrant stated that this level of neural disruption resulted in immediate system failure. Expecting to find the circular pump in a state of terminal arrest, Zhor moved in with his senses active. But the telemetry was impossible. The heart was still cycling, maintaining a steady, stubborn rhythm of 66 beats per minute. The local laws of physics seemed to undergo a sudden, unannounced revision. "Hey, Doc." The voice was a dry, high-friction rattle, coming from a mouth that was clamped tight to minimize cranial vibration. Air nearly suffered a logic loop failure as the human's remaining eye rolled toward him, a wet, unfocused sensor seeking a lock. "Can you help me out here? I think I've got a hardware conflict in my frontal lobe." Zhor stood there, his four hemispheres struggling to reconcile the visual data with the biological reality. It was a total defiance of established medical protocols. The creature was speaking. It was processing external stimuli. It was existing in a state of catastrophic hardware failure. "Captain, please, keep your vocal processor offline," a companion begged, his own voice vibrating with the frequency of a man on the edge of a total breakdown. "Just listen to me for a second and stop the panic routine." The captain retorted, a flash of high-functioning snark appearing in that single, bloodshot eye. "I'm the one with a literal foreign object protruding from my primary processor." The room fell into a sudden, vacuum-like silence. Air moved closer, his limbs twitching with a mixture of surgical instinct and sheer, data-driven awe. "Are you experiencing a high-magnitude pain signal?" he asked, his curiosity finally overriding his baseline horror. The human squinted, the muscles in his face shifting as he attempted to run a self-diagnostic. Negative." "How is the system still online?" Zhor's assistant asked, looking for a logical explanation in a room that had clearly run out of them. "The human brain has a built-in interrupt for pain signals," the ship's medic explained, his voice sounding like it had been through a high-pass filter of pure exhaustion. "It can effectively shut down the sensory feed when the hardware is this compromised. He'll get the full error log once the shock buffer wears off." "Software-level pain suppression? I'll take it," the captain muttered. "How did I end up with an unscripted lobotomy?" "Define lobotomy," Zhor requested, the word sounding like a particularly brutal piece of legacy code. "We'll deal with the documentation later," the medic replied. Zhor would eventually discover that the history of the human lobotomy was a dark, low-tech nightmare of surgical barbarism, but at the moment, he was just fascinated. He had never seen a species capable of surviving such a massive neural interrupt. Any other biological entity in the quadrant would have suffered an immediate, irreversible system shutdown. The sheer kinetic energy of the trauma should have been enough to trigger total organ failure. Instead, the human's brain had simply rerouted the pain traffic and maintained a stable operating environment. In the hours that followed, Zhor executed a complex, multi-threaded surgical procedure to remove the rod, a high-stakes ballet of precision lasers and microgravity extraction. In any other skull, the resulting cavity would have been a total dead zone, but the human medic seemed almost relieved by the final imaging. The orbital bone was a wreck, the ocular sensor was unsalvageable, and the optic cable had been severed. The human was permanently down to 50% visual input, a fact that didn't seem to bother him in the slightest. He was After all, already running on a piece of aftermarket prosthetic hardware for a leg. Who could have predicted that the death world of rumors were actually an understated piece of data? Who would have thought that within a standard week, Zhor would be a contracted surgeon aboard a human vessel, heading into the great void? Who could have truly modeled the human, a species that treats a catastrophic brain injury like a minor hardware bug and keeps right on processing?